Good evening, everyone. I'm Sneha Ragavan, a researcher for Asia Art Archive in India based in New Delhi. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you for today's panel on modern architecture. The panel is organized as part of Modern Art Histories in and across Africa, South and Southeast Asia, or as we like to call it, MAHASSA, which is a collaborative program or initiative of the Cornell University's Institute for Comparative Modernities, the Dhaka Art Summit, and Asia Art Archive, supported by the Getty Foundation. As part of the program at Mahasa, we've been broadly thinking about what it means to do research in modern art and architectural histories outside of, broadly speaking, national frameworks. This is to put it very simply. Now, one way of doing this is, of course, to develop methods for writing transnational histories, to explore what were connections and so on. But alongside this, what I believe is emerging in our conversations is what are probably some of the terms, the critical sort of conceptual frameworks by which we research modern art and architectural histories in ways that help complicate existing sort of narratives, opening up newer ways of seeing, as it were. What do sort of these kinds of efforts do to often sort of insular disciplinary approaches when in fact ideas, people, objects, and so on have traveled or perhaps have found themselves unable to travel? And all of this is perhaps more so when thinking about the built environment and how it shapes and is in turn shaped by how we inhabit it and how we move through it, or are perhaps inhibited from moving through it. How do ideas of infrastructure, of labor, of congestion, of piracy, of perhaps archipelagic imaginaries become interesting ways of thinking about context specific to what we're calling the global south? And what has been the role of architecture in all of this? In today's panel on modern architecture, we have with us four speakers who will be talking about modernisms as they were practiced outside of Euro-American contexts. Many of our speakers wear multiple hats. We have practicing architects, curators, educators, scholars, editors of journals. We have archivists, researchers. We just have four speakers, of course. So what we'll hope to hear as well, I think, are their thoughts on modern architecture, stemming from also these specific points from their own practice as well. The format for the evening is that I will introduce our speakers one by one and invite them to make their presentations. They'll be speaking for about 15 minutes or so, so that we have time for discussion. Our first speaker for the evening is Sean Anderson. Sean is Associate Curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. A fellow of the American Academy in Rome and the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa. He has degrees in architectural design and architectural history from Cornell University, an M.Arch from the Princeton University, and a PhD in art history from the University of California, Los Angeles. He has practiced as an architect and taught in Afghanistan, Australia, India, Italy, Morocco, Sri Lanka, and the UAE. His book, Modern Architecture and Its Representation in Colonial Eritrea, was published in 2015 and was nominated for the AIFC Bridge Book Award for Nonfiction. At MoMA, he has organized the exhibitions Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter in 2016, Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age 2017-18, and the forthcoming with Mabel Wilson, Reconstructions, Architecture, and Blackness in America. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Sneha. Good evening. I think this is an opportune moment to thank Diana Campbell here on the front row and everyone involved in the Dhaka Art Summit, all of the people who make this place happen over the course of only a few weeks. I had the great pleasure and perhaps displeasure at certain moments to install part of our show down on the first floor after traveling for 26 hours from New York to get here. And in that transit, in that set of transits, I have been thinking about this particular presentation on how we could understand and conceptualize this space of transit. It's one in which I think many of us participate in, experience, perhaps try to deny in certain ways, but also that spaces of transit are fundamentally architectural, and that the histories of architecture and the histories of modernism and architecture are embedded in notions of transit, of movements of people and movements of meanings across territories and continents and oceans and seas. And so I had been thinking about what it means to move and what it means to create a line. And what is a line? Lines inevitably are catalytic. They divide, they can build, they can remove, they can be dotted, they can be dashed, they can have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or they can be continuous and dynamic and ever-changing. And so this evening I thought I would talk about what it means then to invest in ideas around lines of control, and when lines become borders, and when lines are built as not only a defense, but also a way of representing and trying to understand oneself in space. And that self can be a nation as much as an individual. So what I'd like to argue this evening in a number of images and a number of examples that not only take place within South Asia, but also in East Africa, are different kinds of lines of control and how we might begin to redefine what control looks like. In fact, what I'd like to say is that lines of control inevitably inflect absences. And so tonight I wanted to talk about what does absence look like? And what does absence look like when every line contains its own failure? So I'd start with this image, which is the Pragati Maidan. It's the remnants of Rajraval's Hall of Nations, which I think is not only a metaphor for the status of a-modernism in South Asia, in particular in India and in Delhi, but also this notion of an architecture that has been overlooked for quite some time, and trying to understand what failure is in the case of when governments and politics begin to redefine the nature of space. So I wanted to begin with another kind of line, a dynamic line that was drawn quite early in the colonization of Eritrea, which was Italy's firstborn colony. They called it La Colonia Primogenita, the firstborn. And it was a line that was drawn from the coast of Massawa to Asmara, which was eventually the capital of Eritrea, and eventually the capital of the Italian Empire. This line then became a cableway, which you see here, a ropeway, a cableway, La Teleferica, and it was eventually built as a way of transporting goods across a number of very difficult landscapes rather than using a road. And so this ropeway eventually started to move people as well as goods. And then by the late 30s, after it was finished, they would connect video cameras. They would connect film cameras and film this landscape in order to map it and try to understand the best places to build new towns, to build new settlements and infrastructures. So in this sense, lines can also be spaces of surveillance and power. But there's another kind of line that is drawn, and it's with us now, very much a part of us, and very much a part of the question of what it means to be modern today, or contemporary, in fact. These lines represent people. They represent transits across huge swaths of landscapes, of continents and seas, in order to reach a destination or not, as the case may be. And I find that these lines are often, in their abstractness, far more difficult to comprehend. Or these lines that are actual infrastructural and built into the landscape as part of the extension of a landscape. This is the border wall of Ceuta between Morocco and Spain. It is often the last hurdle, if you will, between reaching the Mediterranean and Europe for many refugees and asylum seekers. But these lines dramatically shift how we understand scale, and they shift the ways that we understand nationhood and the passage of people and time. These lines organize. They are built as temporary structures to hold people, to contain people, to build people again. And then this is a fairly recent discovery that the film studios where Spartacus and other films like Ben-Hur were filmed in the 40s and 50s, Cinecittà, outside of Rome, was actually a site for refugee shelters. So in a space of spectacle and imagination, the inverse was happening at the same time. These lines are built in order to prevent. They are built to destroy. They are built to contain and embody a certain kind of power that we may not wish upon anyone, but in fact, these lines are designed. And so I wanted to talk very briefly about a context that is fairly close to us right now, that was fundamentally created through the embodiment of lines, the Durand line, the line of control, the Radcliffe line, and the McMahon line. All of these lines built and manifested during the end of the 19th century and early parts of the 20th century created nations like Pakistan, but also undid states like Jammu and Kashmir. These lines inflect new meanings on what it means to embed oneself in a landscape. These lines create and erase culture. And so I wanted to also posit the lines that created Pakistan as a kind of exemplar to then think about the non-aligned movement after the Bandung Conference in 1955. That on one hand, you have lines that are defining nationhood, and then the non-aligned movement says, well, in fact, the systems that created colonial powers and colonial states, actually we don't have lines anymore. We have perhaps a flow, or we have an enmeshment of people and cultures and states. And so this map is drawn as a way of kind of manifesting what were called the chains of allies in midst of Eisenhower's Cold War policies of containment. So lines then also have this strange dialectic in which they can contain, but also be open. And when we look then at the Muslim city of the future that was to be designed by Doxiadis in the 1960s in Pakistan, a new capital, as it were, it would precede the new capital of Dhaka. You have here Ayub Khan and Doxiadis surveying a new landscape that was drawn, in fact, as a grid. And a grid that would then serve as organizing this landscape not only into caste and class, but also serve as axes of power that would contain and embody the ways in which we saw monuments or saw modernism. So lines then also can direct the ways in which we see, and we see each other. So this is the final so-called master plan of Doxiadis for Islamabad. But I find this map to be far more intriguing, because this is, in fact, the map of the nullas, or the streams and water sources that were flowing through the landscape of the grid that Doxiadis embeds in Islamabad. And these nullas actually then start to reorganize the space or spaces that Doxiadis is imagining. And ironically, these are also flood-prone, and still to this day quite flood-prone. And in fact, when the floods happen and they erase part of the landscape, you identify your location or your address by the nulla, or the stream, rather than the sector or the part of the grid in which you are living. And what's happened then over the years is that because of floods, informal settlements are then built in and around these flood zones because no one wants to live there. And so the grid is then supplanted by nature, if you will, by lines of control. And they begin to question the ways in which we understand, perhaps, the dialectic between tradition and modern, or the traditional and the modernity. And this is Doxiadis, prior to arriving in Islamabad, inspecting vernaculars and vernacular architectures that, in fact, are reflective of the influx of refugees after 1947 and 1948 during partition. And I find that these kinds of lines of reciprocity and movement are transformed not only by the architecture of impermanence, by this architecture of settlement and resettlement, but it fundamentally changed the ways in which we can understand a modern architecture as embodying a certain kind of violence. And Doxiadis, in the midst of building Islamabad, is then commissioned to build Karangi, a new housing scheme for the resettlement of Pakistani refugees, who in fact are not refugees, they are citizens, but the term refugee is applied to these individuals, both on the India side as well as on the Pakistan side, as a marker, as an identification that this person, this individual, is moving across a line that has been built to define them. So we look at the Karangi housing scheme of Doxiadis, and what happens here is that there are no more nullas to erase and to transform this space, but a grid. And within this grid, Doxiadis is very much cognizant of the fact that a house or housing or shelter also changes over time and is transformed over time. And unlike his predecessor, Michel Ekushar, who also proposed a housing scheme near Karangi, outside of Karachi, when Doxiadis builds the Karangi housing scheme, he leaves these houses unfinished, with the idea that the individuals who would occupy these houses actually finish them. So lines can also be unfinished, incomplete, yet allowing for potential and for the capacity to define the ways in which we live. Another set of lines in a nearby location. These were designed by Karl Prussia whilst he was master planning Kathmandu Valley. And at the same time, in the 60s, when Tibetan refugees were coming across the Himalaya, there was a profound influx of individuals coming to Kathmandu, for which these structures were built. Or this set of lines for a new city by the Japanese architect Kenzo Tange, And those of you who had the great privilege of visiting Parliament yesterday would also recognize the circle here, a circle as being both a complete or perhaps an incomplete set of lines. Tange is invited to build or master plan the new city of Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha. And only a few of these buildings were actually constructed and finished. But perhaps more close and more prescient and important to consider that right now on the border between Burma and Bangladesh, there are 1.2 million refugees who are also waiting in line to enter Bangladesh. And I wanted to introduce or kind of interrupt my own talk here for a moment to think that while the theme of the Dhaka Art Summit this year has been about movements, I'd like to say that lines can also embody movements. And so the movements of people here in lines or not in lines are both kind of cohabiting the same space. And very washed out photo here, but I wanted to think about then that the movements of refugees today across the African landscape, and now, of course, the peninsular European landscape, changes the ways in which we could understand a modern architecture. And this is a villaggio or a borgo in Sicily that was built under fascism in the late 30s and was immediately abandoned in 1943. And what has happened over the past, say, 5 to 7 years is that the same individuals that once were considered colonial subjects, like Eritreans and Ethiopians and Somalians, are now finding themselves inhabiting these spaces like this one in Sicily. And this return of the refugee, if you will, starts to problematize how we understand an architecture that was fundamentally designed and built to withstand this force. And so I'd like to close then with a set of lines and a set of movements across a landscape, an inhospitable landscape such as the Sahara. This is the artist Samuel Gradacap, who traversed part of the northern Sahara, documenting the temporary structures that were being built by refugees in order to find themselves at the edges of a sea that no longer wanted them. Thank you. Well, I'll leave you with a good photo.
Right. Thank you, Sean. Our next speaker is Simon Soon. Simon is a senior lecturer at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. His research focus includes 19th and 20th century art and visual culture in Southeast Asia. Other research interests include global flows in art, architecture, and visual cultures of Asia, Latin America and Southeast Asian cultural networks and comparative frameworks, and abstraction and modernism in Asia and Africa. His doctoral dissertation investigated the spatio-visual practices of post-war left-leaning art movements in Singapore, Malaya, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines from the 1950s to the 70s. Prior to undertaking academic research, he worked as a curator in the field of Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art. Soon is co-founder and a member of the editorial collective of Southeast of Now, Directions in Contemporary and Modern Art in Asia, a new peer-reviewed journal published by NUS Press. He's also a team member of Malaysia Design Archive, an archival research and education platform on visual cultures of the 20th century. Welcome, Simon.
I don't know where they got the bio. I mean, don't have that Catholic an interest. Okay, so I'm going to talk primarily about odd houses. Odd houses, houses that are strange, houses that doesn't actually sort of like, fit the bill, houses that are not entirely sort of like modernist, or houses that tries to be modernist but fails to be modernist at the same time. And I will look at a few sort of like case studies. It primarily sort of like deals with this figure called Julius Posner, who in 1956 sort of like came to Kuala Lumpur and was sort of like engaged in a sort of like big debate called what is Malayan sort of like architecture, as the country was sort of, coming into sort of like being, gaining its own sort of like independence. There was a huge sort of like architectural sort of like discussion in which Posner was sort of like involved in. And Posner is interesting for me is because if you know of Malaysia, it's primarily a Muslim sort of like country. It's not an Islamic state, but it has a sort of like huge Muslim population, and therefore Jews are not entirely sort of like welcome. It takes on a rather ugly anti-Semitic tone today. And having a Jew to be the principal sort of like founder of the first architecture school in Kuala Lumpur, for me is interesting. And I want to sort of like think about actually what sort of like ideas was he sort of like bringing to KL, at that particular sort of like flashpoint in Malaysian sort of like history. And immediately as he sort of like came to Malaysia, one of the first things that he did was to engage himself in this discussion. So this discussion really sort of like came out of, a co-war politics in which Gerald Templer, in a few years before, was really advocating for a type of modernism that would really embrace or take on the modernist sort of like structural form, but would but he was very encouraging of sort of like tacking on this sort of like clean sort of modernist form with something ornamental. And normally this ornamental sort of like component would come from something that is considered as traditional sort of like culture. So the National Museum that was sort of like built later in the 60s would represent the kind of like inclination that someone like Templer, as the sort of like main high commissioner then, was trying to sort of like promote, where you have the traditional sort of like Malay roof being tacked on to what is essentially a clean up version of a Beaux-Arts sort of building, right? That you can sort of like see here on the screen. But Posner came from, interestingly, it's connected and associated with the Breslau sort of like School of Art. That's in Poland today, but back then it was still part of Germany. And in Breslau, I guess it had a sort of like different temperament compared to, say, the Bauhaus sort of like school. If you think of Bauhaus as that sort of like tedious, kind of like, clean, orthodox, but also very high-minded way of pontificating way of sort of like approaching modernism, right? There's a kind of like whimsicality, a sort of appreciation for curves, and a sort of like sense of sort of like jouissance that very often sort of like come up with Breslau's idea of what modernism is, and its willingness to sort of like play with this sort of like form that I think inform a lot of sort of like Posner's sort of like ideas and how he would sort of like engage with modern architecture in sort of Malaysia. It's definitely going against, any architecture student would be familiar with this sort of like tree. That's the Fletcher sort of like, arboreal, arboreal sort of like history sort of architecture, right? In which when you have sort of like branches that sort of like sticks out and even acknowledge non-Western architecture, it's not really thought of as historical. It doesn't contribute to the historical sort of like progression of understanding the built form and its core component and its sort of like structural principle, right? So when he came to Kuala Lumpur, I think he learned that architecture was doing something very differently. Let me show you, oh, sorry, wait, this one. So when he came to Kuala Lumpur, the first thing that he realized was that as a new sort of like newcomer, he wrote a piece called, Impressions of sort of like a Newcomer. And the first thing he realized was that there was no sort of like sense of progress. You have your Chinese there with their temples and their clan halls and their sort of like shop houses. You have, of course, the Malay sort of like village, as well as sort of like the urban villages that sort of like skirted around the sort of like main city area. You have your colonial bungalows, and then you have your sort of Indian temples, you have your Portuguese sort of square, you have your sort of like Dutch town halls, all sort of like intermixing in this sort of like weird little sort of like palimpsest. And he talks about this as if the sun, he calls it the sun forgives everything, you know, in the Malayan sort of like soil, just because it doesn't make sort of like temporal sense. It doesn't have any sort of like temporal logic to how things are sort of like supposed to sort of like issue forth and progress. This, I think, would slowly then inform his take on modernism. He would principally sort of like put his foot down and not sort of like agree with what Templer has sort of like proposed. Ornamental tack-on was not a thing for architects in the 1950s, but he was a great proponent of a kind of like timber modernism that he was experimenting with the sort of like Forest Research Institute in KL at that time. And it would sort of like work with students to produce prototypes that would measure against sort of like concrete modernist sort of like structure and sort of like, you know, compare them in terms of their cost effectiveness to build this on a level of sort of like a large scale production. So his way of sort of like, you know, thinking about architecture, I think in the 1950s was interesting to me, principally to sort of like compare him as a sort of like outlier sort of like figure with the first two women architects who went to school in the AA School of sort of like Architecture, and that was in the 1930s. This was the photo that they took before they left for the AA school. Unfortunately, because of the slum, they never managed to sort of like finish they never sort of like finish their studies. They come from a sort of like well-to-do sort of like commercial press family, but as you can tell from all these sort of like family photos, it was a very big family. So when, you know, when the slum sort of like came about in the 1930s, they were not able to sort of like finish their education. One of them did, however, persevere. And I was sort of like interested to sort of understand why she sort of like persevered. She went on to work for an architecture firm as a draftsperson and later joined the public works department. And after the war, managed to secure a scholarship in which she was then able to sort of like complete her studies. And she would then sort of like come back to Kuala Lumpur in the 1950s, the very same year that Posner would arrive in KL. Both of them would have never, I don't think I've ever sort of like found evidences that both of them have sort of like met. In any case, her story ends here pretty much. I could not identify any of the buildings that she's ever built, but I don't think, all I know is that she did sort of like go back into the public works department. That means a lot of her sort of, the buildings that were built by the public works department would have been gone under her sort of like draftsmanship, except that they were not sort of like signed by her, right? And this then led me to think about, I guess, what Posner sort of like wrote about, which is this article called Odd Houses. I show you. Odd Houses was a very sort of like whimsical celebration of all these sort of strange modernist sort of like buildings that were sort of, that were popping up in Kuala Lumpur in the 50s and 1960s, during the moment of sort of like independence. And it was a moment that you find modernist architecture being sort of done in the most sort of like gaudy, tasteless, and in some ways design, in terms of its design, it doesn't even make sense. It's just sort of like, you know, a jumble of sort of like lines put together on the drawing board, and voila, you have a building that looks modernist, vaguely modernist, but doesn't really sort of like conform with all these sort of like design principles. But Odd Houses, I think, was Posner also trying to celebrate these houses. He was in some ways, I don't think he ever sort of like reconciled the fact that they're ugly or the fact that they're not sort of like good design. But in the article, you see him struggling through the sort of like you see him struggling through the text, a real sort of like a real sense that he was actually trying to like the house. He calls them happy. He calls them sort of like happy houses. And thinking about all these sort of like odd houses is interesting to me as someone who's interested in outlier sort of like forms of cultural expression. I am not so sort of like primarily interested in what is sort of like canon. Anyway, canonical sort of like forms of architecture very often doesn't sort of like tell you very much about how people sort of like adapt and use actually sort of like modern materials and modern sort of like build structure in a very sort of like interesting manner. And one thing that I've been working on, another project I've been working on, was really looking at this sort of like figure over here. It belongs to a sort of house temple named Klang. Klang is not KL. Klang is it's sort of like almost like its sort of like shadow counterpart. It's located 30 minutes away from KL. It's a port city, and you find right at the banks of sort of like KL of Klang, a small little sort of like house temple that houses this figure called Datuk Fatima. She, as the sort of like story goes, she's a sort of like Javanese princess, but she was worshipped in a sort of like Chinese temple. And that's just to sort of like show you that her place is in sort of like the northern banks of the sort of river. It belongs to a working class sort of like community, and that community used to sort of like, it was a place for the transshipment of sort of like coals and mangrove sort of like wood. The piers has since been sort of like filtered up. It's a rather sort of like depressed sort of like looking community where you find this interesting sort of like structure built right next to the sort of like bank. So on the surface, it might look like a sort of like normal house temple, but look at it closely. What you see is that it has this sort of like tiered roof structure that looks like that resembles a traditional sort of like Nusantara mosque. In Southeast Asia, mosque construction normally composed of either the 3-tier or 5-tier sort of like roof sort of structure. But at the same time, it also has its sort of like swallow ridge tail sort of like roofing that's referencing sort of like Southern Hokkien sort of like architectural vernacular. At the same time, you also see, a playful sort of like conscription of the Mughal kind of like dome in the two, cutouts that sort of like flank the mosque. Look closer inside, you see this sort of like being replicated within the altar itself. And in the altar, that's where it's sort of like this sort of like figure sits. So what's sort of like happening here with this architecture, this sort of like, very sort of strange pastiche-like kind of like architecture going on there. In the 1980s, what happened was the medium started what they call jumping. It came alive. It started, there's a medium there who started sort of like channeling this deity. And what we sort of like learned from this period in which the medium started to sort of like jump was that there was historically, I think there was a sort of like Javanese community that sort of like used to live there. But the moment in which he jumped was also in the period that a new sort of like generation of Javanese migrant workers was coming into the country, was entering this country. It was the period in which, under the 4th Prime Minister of Malaysia, and who is also, again, today's Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, he was an instigator of this sort of like modernization project that really encouraged the use of sort of like neighboring migrant workers to sort of like come to Malaysia and work. And with the Chinese community in the 1980s, they've gained enough sort of like social mobility to sort of like move out of the village, right? They're moving out to a neighboring sort of like suburb. So what happened was that it was also a very timely opportunity that the Javanese sort of migrant workers were starting to rent properties around the temple. And naturally, they found in Dato Fatima a natural sort of like ancestor or ally. So I was sort of interested to think about the kind of like not just sort of like transcultural, but more importantly, a trans-historical sort of like bond that was established between the Chinese and the Javanese as sort of like migrant communities in the Klang itself. And this house temple accommodated this sort of like this sort of very interesting kind of like political kind of like allegiance and produce a kind of like sovereignty sort of like out of this sort of like allegiance. Why this is sort of like interesting to me? Because the standard narrative of how you're able to sort of like make it in Malaysia, how you're able to sort of like gain certain kind of like entrance into the membership of Malaysian sort of like citizenry, is to prove that you have accrued enough cultural capital so that you're recognized as a man of sort of like importance. A portrait like this, celebrating the sort of like comprador leadership in the sort of like colonial sort of like Malaya, is representative of this sort of like the self-made, this idea of the self-made person. But I think in the outlier, the figure of the outlier, the sovereignty actually lies in the fact that they're able to sort of like build interesting kind of like allegiances, interesting sort of like, not allegiances, interesting sort of like alliances across sort of like language and sort of like cultural groups. And sometimes these sort of like language and cultural groups are not always necessarily communicable, right? It's centered on that kind of very interesting kind of like touch and go sort of like relationship that has defined the relationship between the Chinese and the Javanese in a port city like Klang, and thinking about art houses and thinking about all these sort of like strange little sort of like pockets across different parts of the world, not just in sort of like Malaysia, as facilitators of all these kinds of like unique sort of like trans-historical sort of like alliances, actually, I think makes a sort of like very interesting case for the different ways in which to just sort of like, as a rejoinder to what sort of like Sean have sort of like talked about just now, as a sort of like very interesting space for different kinds of relationships to sort of like grow and foster and prosper. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Our next speaker is Nurur Rahman Khan, who is a practicing architect, architectural historian, and an academic. He's the director of the Muzharul Islam Archive, a founding partner of TK&RK Associates, an architectural firm spearheading contemporary thoughts in Bangladeshi architecture. He is also pursuing his PhD from the Università di Venezia in architectural history and criticism. He has lectured widely in universities around the world. Welcome, Nurur.
What I'd like to talk about today is something called something that I perceive as modernity within modernity. And I will try to make it, I'll try to bring it to you through one particular architect, Muzharul Islam, who's the first architect of Bangladesh. But what I want to do is to take you through his life and different stages of life and see how he himself was addressing modernity at different times of his life also. So first of all is his search for a modernity within modernity, and the next, that how his narrative of this modernity within himself also changed through time. You know, one of the things that happened is when Bangladesh and Pakistan and India was all being born was the end of the colonial era. But it did leave a huge shadow behind. And it did at that time created a lot of collaborators. So when we were all these people trying to, you know, find ourselves in a post-colonial era, we have to understand there was also this continuity of, for lack of a better word, collaborators that still existed in this scenario. But then comes the question of then how do you build your own identity? I mean, on one hand, Islam had to understand that he is, in a way, a new country, a Bangladesh or a East Pakistan at that time, and to look at his country for what it is in a particular way, but also to problematize the situation, to understand that very early on, Bengali women were educated, liberated, and it was not this only vernacular perspective which is easy for or comfortable for you to understand Bangladesh with, but there were other aspects of Bangladesh which are very strong social conditions which existed all through Bangladesh, which needed to be dealt with also. The next thing is that as an architect, to look at the archetype of a place like Bengal, where the pavilion architecture would be the predominant kind of architecture that would be needed. So it gets very, very complex in this post-colonial era and the trying to search for identity, kind of having a prescribed identity for architecture. And then, his response to all this. So the first thing, the first project that he did was the art college. It was in, what I want you to keep on noticing is the dates, 1953. So this is post-partition, just after the language movement. So there was a huge need to create an identity in architecture and to also break away from the, I would say, colonial hangover, search for and search for a modernity. And what Muzharul Islam's search in this modernity was not alone. The artists, writers, thinkers of that time all were very strongly looking towards modernity as a way to build the nation. So it became almost a politics of nation building, and which modernity was a very important, played a very important role. In the Fine Art Institute, one can say is that it's like almost in one master stroke, he set the departure from what was before and the first break to what will continue to for a long time. And it was architecture never done in this part of the world, considered to be the first modern building. Convene this building came 1 year later after this. So it was extraordinary for Islam to come up with this as his first building. The Fine Art Institute created a language away from the bungalow, away from the colonial strength of buildings, away from a new kind of lightness. And some people would try to describe it just as a tropical architecture, but it is far more than that. And I think this is where modernity fails. It tries to identify buildings in a particular way and not understand the intentions of this building. So this is what I mean by the modernity within modernity. There was a very strong intention to design like this. A wall which would seem very simple is actually a tribute to the whole history of terracotta architecture of Bengal, which would date back thousands of years. And it is a very deliberate drawing that wall was produced from. A beautiful space that continues to generate artists over time. The public library, just immediately after that, but just after his first building, Islam took another turn. And this was his, he was very strongly into left-wing politics. He was connected very strongly to the Communist Party at that time. And and for him, he saw that a socialist solution was going to be needed for a country like Bangladesh. So it's very strange. You see, you have to understand that when he was designing this, he just completed his architecture in America. So we have an American trained architect whose total, political, belief system is based on Marxist politics, and he has a socialist agenda himself, and a very strong agenda to develop a modern identity of a Bengali nation. Yeah. So the next project, what becomes so important to see in this project is that it has 4 artworks commissioned in this library, and they're till date the largest collection of commissioned artwork in any government building. This is the library itself. This is Navira's work as you enter on the ground level of the building. And then you'd go up a ramp on the first floor. The building actually starts on the first floor. And then from the first floor would be Aminul Islam's. This is just the reception desk. There's a work over there. And then there's another work by Aminul Islam. But the next beautiful thing is that you enter actually the library hall on the first floor, and you look down on research and education and this whole pursuit of knowledge in almost like a holy way, and which was very important for the people of Bangladesh at time to see education in a very extremely important position. And then the next thing that happened is that he went in the middle to AA school, in the Tropical School of Architecture, and he was extremely unimpressed actually. One of the reasons is that when he went over there, the first thing he realized that he's already done that. And the other thing that he realized was that if he continued on the path of making architecture that is only climate responsive, only responsive to place, it will not be enough. He will be sidelined just as AA School's tropical architecture was eventually. And then after that, when his return, he went to Yale. I think that is a huge transformation on him. But coming back from Yale, one of the first work is that he did his own house. And it was a turn away from this light architecture into architecture which is more stronger, which is more built. And it is, in many ways, I would say, a new modern for him. And the building, and what we can see is that it is, in a way, his first steps to become more universal in his architecture, not to be more particular to a position or to a place. And then, and he's working with architecture in a more refined manner, I would say. But within that, I just want to point out a couple of things that never leaves him all through his journey, is his identity as a Bengali. If we see those lines over here, I think there might be a pointer over here. These lines are little kind of seeds in the landscape, in the garden, because what happens is that time in the 60s in Dhanmondi, this is where it is, all these 2-story buildings, everybody would sit out in the afternoon and have tea. And this place becomes an event place for invitations, for children to run and then rest, other people to sit during a larger gathering. So, I mean, something which almost goes unnoticed is his, let's say, inclusion of his own identity into something otherwise that he was removing himself from this light tropical architecture that he was doing before. The Polytechnic Institute was, again, another event where coming back, he partnered up with Stanley Tigerman, who was his classmate in Yale, and this was another for him. He wanted to start working with all his classmates, and even brings his professor Paul Rudolph over at one time. And over here we kind of see the activist Muzharul Islam that we had immediately after the partition, moving away to be more collaborative with the let's say Western architects, and accepting that it would be accepting the fact that he wants to actually take his country forward rather than hang on to his leftist, strong belief system. So it was, for him, I think it was a departure when he started doing the Polytechnics and, along with Stanley Tigerman. The 5 master plans of Polytechnics are here in the exhibition, And if one notices, it's a remarkable project in the sense is that all these are prototype buildings in 5 different locations in Bangladesh, but with very, very strong, situations within the master plans. For example, in this particular project, one approaches the main building past this garden of mangoes. I mean, it's a mango orchard. So one of the mango trees. I mean, so when you come in here and you basically pass this orchard, and there's a government complex on that side, and this is the Bogura master plan, a place in north of Bengal very much known for where the mangoes and lychees and all these come from. On this particular master plan, it's where you pass a water and you almost celebrate this water body. This one is from Sylhet, and it's in Sylhet, ponds and water bodies were also very important. Another one, rush to this one. This is the one in Khulna. Khulna is dotted with canals and water bodies, and we can see that this one is surrounded by 2 water bodies, and the future extension will again be surrounded by 2. It is again taking the particularity of the region. So it's very strange that even while working with Stanley Tigerman, American architect, on a project which was building Bangladesh at that time, or taking it forward in terms of technology, he was still hanging on to things which were for him the way he saw his country. And and he never lets go of that. He never lets kind of balance, is always able to balance that identity situation. This is again, but when we look at the plans, remarkable solutions of a series of lines in which you can have different spaces and different floors and different dimensions. Again, one thing to notice is that the initial plan done by Tigerman was not like that. He transforms them into this because he needs these walls to be thin and nearer to each other for one reason: to reduce the cost of these buildings. This is something that the initial design was done with columns and beams, and he was very concerned about the quality of construction that he will get in 5 different parts of Bangladesh. So this is very interesting, that how he's able to, in his mind, juggle all this and take a project forward and still leave it on as an architectural abstraction. That's the one in Sylhet. This is the one in Bogura. That's the director's bungalow. I don't want to talk about the architecture, it gets too long. This is building is totally north-south ventilated. You can control the light and air as much as you want. This is something very particular to his architecture. This is the water tower. Jahangirnagar University started just before the Liberation War. It was the time when the country decided to have another university other than Dhaka University. And a master plan was built around this wonderful landscape where there was a large water body. And the way that he looked at this master plan was where architecture and nature would coexist. And his architecture would be, in a way, disciplining lines, but in the same moment, completely celebrating every aspect of the natural setting. What Islam does over here, he wanted to still create these large courtyards of inside where students would get out and meet each other. The reason for this is that, as you have to remember, it's just before the Liberation War, and there was a problem with between the Bangladeshi students and the West Pakistani students who were studying together here in Bangladesh. In structure, Bengalis were smaller, weaker. People coming from West Pakistan were taller, stronger, and they almost felt that they were intimidated by West Pakistanis in many ways. And he said that the first thing that we need to build is build their backbone, not first their education. And they needed to raise all these students who would come from colleges from all over Bangladesh. Some would come from very small colleges, from distant places, not even proper towns. But when they come into a university, they need to feel that they're they've come into a very strong place of learning, and to build that attitude, he thought comradeship was very important, and that also comes a little bit from his socialist standpoints also. But what it does in these buildings is that when you make his courtyard, you basically end up with one wing facing the west, which is a kind of wrong architecture in our part of the world. But he manages it by turning the windows away in a very clever way, and he creates this wonderful hostels with this wonderful courtyards in between, and it's set in that landscape that I just showed you. A wonderful solution to a problem of climate, but the real thing to look over here is that a total departure from anything which is elemental as architecture, just a pure abstraction in its elevation. But what I feel over here, he brings back classicism with these scales and heights when he's doing this architecture to give that importance about education and this institution. This is, again, at that same time, very close, the same attitude where I feel that he's bringing in the strength of buildings, a very almost refined classicism in architecture. But again, the buildings is, with these canopies, it's a building which is very successful in this part of the climate, is the way it's supposed to work and the way we are supposed to build. But what I feel is that slowly he's removing himself for anything that will appear particular, that would appear Pakistani or Bangladeshi, but would actually be more of a purer architecture, but will still embed the particularity of place, climate, and situation. Chittagong University was again built at the same time. It was completed after the Liberation War, where he takes it a step further. It was built at the same time that Louis Khan was working, a way that he was looking at the landscape, but he was making these strong buildings again. They would exist in the landscape with strength, because it was important for him to portray that strength rather than to become modern. There's one fantastic building over there where he takes this landscape of Chittagong and he makes this auditorium where from one green room he serves the stage of the amphitheater, which is outside, set against the hills, and also the same stage and the other stage inside the auditorium itself. A wonderful solution where he actually deals with the landscape, and it can only happen in Chittagong, and that is very interesting for me. That's the auditorium. This is, I don't know if you've been around Dhaka, but there's a monument dedicated to the people who lost their lives in the language movement. Over here is another monument that he designed for the language movement martyrs to be built in Chittagong University. And it was unbuilt, but what I feel is these towers at different heights, a bit like the Barragan towers that you see, but which was built much, much later than this. And you see that somehow he is gaining strength. He's moving himself from this that anxiety of partition, anxiety of post-colonialism. He's gaining strength as in identity. He knows how he's taking his nation forward, and then he's moving towards to make it more international rather than to be more particular. The other thing was, and I think that moving towards international was the thing that happened after he came back from Yale, not when he was in England. I've got just two more projects to show you. This is the Limestone Factory that happened again at that time after the Liberation War. And over here, what we see is again, a freed Muzharul Islam, a Muzharul Islam who's won the war for his country. We have a free country, and then now all he needs to do is take this country forward in mind, and there is no more anxiety of trying to, fight anything. And I think that comes out beautifully in this project. He works with much freer hands. He creates much more bolder architecture with more strength. He's taking brick forward. He's taking the building massing forward, creating different kind of architecture that we have not seen in brick architecture in this part of the world. And again, works very well with climate. He reduces elements in his architecture, and he starts experimenting more with composition in an abstract form. This is one of his last projects. It was built in '79. It was the library and archives in Agargaon. And what I love about this project is that if you look carefully, it could have been built by any one of the master architects of that time. In fact, I've put it up in exhibitions, and most people confuse it with a building designed by Lou Kahn. And this is, for me, this is where I think he has finally found himself. So it was for him a journey going from a post-partition Pakistan from 1947, and then building his first work in '53, to coming into post-war Bangladesh in '79, where he finds a very established country, and he looks for more hope, and he sees his country succeed, and he can remove himself from all anxiety and do architecture with a much freer mind. So I just would like to end with this quote from Lou Kahn, that we are all born with a sense of what to do. Within our own singular limits, we know instinctively that given a sufficient opportunity to put this instinct into practice, we know what to do almost instantaneously, if what we do is true to our singularity. And Muzharul Islam had always been that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nurur. Our fourth and final speaker for this panel is Farhan Karim, who is Assistant Professor of Architectural History at the University of Kansas. He has authored the recently published book of Greater Dignity Than Riches, Austerity and Housing Design in India. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Kansas, he has taught at the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, as well as at the University of Asia Pacific. His recent work is in multiple areas. One of those projects is a historical inquiry of American DIY culture, with a focus on shifting notions of domesticity and what it meant for post-war American women. Another project explores the cultural history of reinforced concrete in India between 1910 and 55, tracing threads connecting architectural modernism, anti-colonial movement, and tectonic evolution in South Asia. Yet another project explores the development of modern architecture of undivided Pakistan, from a transnational perspective of post-colonial modernism as being a Cold War construct, of ideological transferences between local and global agencies. Welcome, Farhan.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Diana Campbell and Iftikhar Dadi, for inviting me. And thank you very much, our tremendous audience this evening, for their wonderful patience. I will not take that much time. I must also confess that I do not actually have that many very beautiful slides. Rather, what I would like to do is to make some connections among the themes that our previous speakers made, so that we can have some productive discussion, I hope. So today I'd like to bring a very simple question to our table, is that who will write architectural history in Bangladesh and why? This is a very simple question, but as an educator, this is a very challenging question for me because the way we write today, the way we write about South Asia, and specifically when it comes to history of Bangladeshi art and Bangladeshi architecture, the knowledge is mostly produced in the West, like, you know, the diasporic academic like myself and many others who work in a Western institutional framework, and then we produce knowledge about Southwest, and we sometimes on our seasonal flight to this part of country, we come and we disseminate and publish our work. So the question that I'm trying to ask here today is that what is the institutional challenge today in Bangladesh to produce career architectural historian, curators, archivists, and architectural history educator in Bangladesh? This is a question, but I'd like to render or demonstrate this question and some related challenge to this question by through a very, very small case study. So first is Sean's line of connection, line of partition, line of division. This is a sketch. This is a sketch, actually not a sketch, but you can also call it a sketch, from Konstantinos Doxiadis, the Greek architect, who designed the master plan and worked on multiple Pakistani government projects, both in East Pakistan and West Pakistan. The first time, he was actually an architect who worked mainly for Ayub Khan's government. The first time when he visited East Pakistan, he was given a brief from the CDA office, the Capital Development Authority's office, about the impression of East Pakistan. So, you know, what the people like in East Pakistan, you know, what kind of food they like, what kind of cultural orientation they have, you know, and we all know about the Western Pakistan's officials' perception about the East Pakistani people. So they are, you know, some people who needs to be educated further to become good Muslim. So that is the ideological baggage that came to Doxiadis, and he traveled from West Pakistan to East Pakistan. This is my drawing, and this is, you know, the drawing from his archive, where he was trying to imagine a line, a straight line that connects, this is his sketch, a straight line that connects West Pakistan and East Pakistan. The challenge for Doxiadis was to imagine a territory, a nation state, a very unique thing in modern history that was fractured along this, you know, India, which is literally 1,000 miles, more than 1,000 miles apart. And the problem for Doxiadis was that he was given the task to create an architectural style in East Pakistan that will resemble an imaginary ideology of undivided Pakistan. But for Doxiadis, he had no clue about, you know, what it meant to be an ideal Pakistan, and he also have no clue about East Pakistan. Now, I'm not going to in detail about, you know, what kind of project that he did, and, you know, the politics of his project in East Pakistan. Something that I'm planning to talk about in more depth in my talk tomorrow. But I just like to introduce this idea that these lines, in extending Sean's provocation, I'd like to say these lines can also indicate the lines of imagination. Lines of imagine, these lines is non-existent. Of course, these are air flight route, but this line also help Doxiadis to imagine a historic utopia, an archipelago, and a utopian archipelago, which we call nation state. And I think this is the first challenge for the career historian who are writing or trying to write history of Pakistan in modern time. Like, for example, for Bangladeshis, today's Bangladeshi, the history of Bangladesh actually starts from 1971. And for today's Pakistani, history continues from 47 ongoing. And the Bangladesh is actually an aberration and, something that happened on the side. So the question, the way we organize our historiographic narration, the way we write history, both art history and architecture history, that has a blind spot in our imagination. So just extending the line of line of imagination. There's a blind spot, which I'm calling the pre-secession Pakistan between 1947 and 71. So broadly speaking, this is the mental map of historiographic imagination of today's, our colleague who are writing on Pakistan, today's Pakistan. So it's an extension from colony and Pakistan, and there's an end. And for Bangladesh, the history starts at 71. Anything that starts before 47 is a prelude of something that will eventually move forward and becoming Bangladesh. But honestly speaking, the whole concept of Bangladesh was not even born, until 1960s or late 60s. So the question is that how we can critically question this thinking about nation state, and how nation state, how we can go beyond or critically reassess or reframe our nation state centric historiographic narration. So extending this theme, I would like to somehow very briefly summarize what happened during that blind spot between 47 and 71. What happened in that blind spot, both in West Pakistan and East Pakistan. So Ayub Khan, General Ayub Khan, who introduced the concept of basic democracy. And this is very important for us to know, because that actually connects us to Nurur Khan's presentation. So in Muzharul Islam Oeuvre, or even Constantinos Doxiadis' work in Pakistan, we see the dominance of educational institutes, like so many technical institutes, university, one of the largest primary education reformation programs for East and West Pakistan, under which, today's all government laboratory, ideal school, that was all produced. Art schools, home economics school, agricultural school, all university. The budget for construction during Ayub Khan, besides Islamabad and Korangi, most of the budget was poured to build educational institute. The question is why? And we need to look at this moment, this blind spot, both East Pakistan and West Pakistan, through this political context of basic democracy. So we all are aware, this is a basic democracy is a new definition of democracy that was endorsed by Ayub's United States friends. Basic democracy is a limited form of democracy. Ayub Khan argued that Pakistani people, both West and East, they're not educated enough, they're not sensible enough, and they're not informed enough to practice Western style democracy. So we need a different kind of democracy. So he produced his form of democracy, and he produced a small booklet. That booklet was sent to all the architects, all the Western architects who were working in Pakistan. The booklet reached to Louis Khan's table, Doxiadis' table, everyone. And everyone endorsed this idea that Pakistani people, including Louis Khan, that Pakistani people needs to be educated. We need to educate them to become, to be a real practitioner of democracy. So that is the basic fundamental context. Ford Foundation came and they started to pour money on educational reformation, educational project. So that is, I think, that one of the things that we need to understand to really critically approach that blind spot. So besides educational project, there were two other school system centers and the establishment of two new capital, Islamabad and West and capital complex. So that's something that connects to Sean's talk. So some of the, we talked about this one, Nurur Khan showed this beautiful Polytechnic Institute, something that I'd like to extend on Nurur Khan's explanation on Polytechnic. There is an interesting information that I recently came across, that this project was, Polytechnic project was funded by World Bank at a specific moment where, again, the whole idea was to we really need to harness the human resource of this country. And one of the World Bank, so the commission went to architect Muzharul Islam, but one of the condition in the in the contract is that Muzharul Islam can only design this project if he partnered with a Western architect. So the collaboration, so this is, again, comes a very interesting twist in the entire story of collaboration between Western architects and Eastern architects. So collaboration gained a totally different meaning. So many of the Western architects came as a consultant in that blind spot and work as basically as a guard of the grant money that World Bank and other funding agencies were given. We all know that, and Nurur Khan beautifully demonstrate that design was actually, the entire design, the development of the module, the siting, everything was done by Muzharul Islam. It is a Muzharul Islam project, but officially, Stanley Tigerman also, the other collaborative architect, he also get this credit. And in reality, Tigerman worked as a gatekeeper or the guardian of the money of the World Bank. So this makes this whole concept, this gives us a kind of chance or opportunity to really look at this idea of collaboration between West and East, global North and global South in that moment. Then another thing that I would like to indicate here, this is one of the very successful project of Konstantinos Doxiadis, the person who was designing Islamabad. And he designed a rural academy, rural development program academy in Comilla, which is known as BARD. And here I would like to make some sort of in connection with, I forget his name, Simon's presentation, is this use of odd houses. If you look closely, the main auditorium, this is the main auditorium. The main auditorium take the shape of a traditional rural thatched hut that we call dochala. Dochala means two-roofed thatched hut. So here, Doxiadis tried to find inspiration from the vernacular form, or what Simon says a quiche, the popular form or the quiche. Interesting thing about Doxiadis, and that also complicates his role in Pakistan, that Doxiadis, more often we read him, like, just trying to make connection with Sean Anderson talk there, as a person who is imposed this gigantic greed on the urban scale. But here we find a very interesting aberration, something that he usually do not do. He was trying to find inspiration from the local form. I recently also find a very interesting document, a 350-page report that Doxiadis produced before he get commission, his large-scale commission from Ayub Khan's government. Ford Foundation sponsored him to survey the vernacular architecture in West and East Pakistan. So in that report, he very explicitly recommend the pre-Ayub Khan government that Pakistan should not build any monument. So I'm not making up the story. He recommend that Pakistan should not build any monument because Pakistan does not know what a monument is in the Western sense. So and he said that it's all about folk architecture. So he used the word and he theorized the whole concept of folk. The vernacular, he specifically used the term folk. So he said that he went on very explicitly that what is the folk wisdom that exists in West and East Pakistan, and how modern architecture can learn from these folk or quiche images or knowledge. But interestingly, when he got commissioned from Ayub Khan, of course, that thesis did not work. Ayub Khan's government wanted to build monuments, so he put aside that thesis, and this is the only place where in East Pakistan he found an opportunity to create an odd-looking an odd house in the middle of a didactic educational structure. So this is all the Western architects who came to work in Pakistan. All of them had local collaborators for many technical reasons. Like I talked about Tigerman, Louis Kahn, Doc Siedis, Vrooman, Edward Durrell Stone, Richard Neutra, and Paul Riddle. So they all came in that blind spot and worked for Pakistan. So one thing that also is written off from our historiographic narration is that all these architects, these Western architects, when they came and surveyed through the landscape, we mostly see their photographs and drawings and sketches about the landscape, about the buildings that they surveyed. So they were basically the beholder, the kind of, they wander among, within the landscape as a voyeur. So they get inspiration, they took sketches, so they acted as a voyeur, as some the observer. But one thing which is not explicitly discussed in our historiographic narration is that the people of Pakistan also gazed back to this Western voyeur. Like these photographs of Doc Siedis, the first time when he traveled through East Pakistan through an amphibian biplane, the first time he landed along a river, so there is the people, the native people who are gazing back and kind of, gathered to see the circus that came to town. And this is another photograph taken by Khan's associate, Henry Wilcott. It was not taken by Khan, but his associate. But we still see when Khan was walking through the old Dhaka. So that is the situation. So this is, another perspective, gazing back from the global south to the masters who came and designed for us. So I'd just like to finish with four questions. The first two is questions regarding institutional infrastructure. I'd like to provoke my colleagues and the audience to engage in discussion. Number one is that, can we imagine new approaches and methods that, instead of considering architectural history as an apparatus to document facts from the past, and instead can we create a critical space of engaged thinking? Number two, the question that I'd like to ask is that, how can architectural history provide the platform to the subjective, which is theory and philosophy-based discussion, often very subjective opinion of the history writer, in the relationship with the empirical evidence, like archival documents and interviews, that will provide a space for new debates and discourse about the future of practice. Here, which is very crucial for me to understand, is that, let's say 50 years or 60 years from now, when our students would like to write history, let's say on Nurur Khan's career, so what will be the archive that they will probe into? So where is that archive? So what kind of archive that our current generation that we are building for our future generation historian? And what are the challenges of building that archives? And the questions regarding techniques of writing. Number one, how we can investigate the different modalities of architectural history to explore the past and present of Bangladeshi architecture. Our historiographic narration, our discussion of Bangladeshi architecture is very much centered on this idea of a pure, a very pure, sometimes holy idea of Bangladesh as a nation state, how we can challenge that. Number two, what is the conceptual and historical limit of Bangladeshi architecture as a historiographic narrative? And number three, which is my last one, that in doing so, can we understand the terms Bangladesh and Bengali not as a natural and a priori conditions? Rather, can we offer alternative narratives by approaching these terms as historically imagined, geopolitical entities, and culturally conditioned ideas that demand critical historiographic attention? Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Farhan. Can I request all the speakers to come up so that we can actually have a discussion? Okay, thank you so much, all of you. I think we got some very specific but also connecting sort of points between each of your presentations. I have two questions for you, but I think maybe just take one for the moment and then open it up, because I think there will be a lot of questions for this panel. One of the things that struck me was that outside of master architects, there is a world of building that happens, whether it is engineers, whether it's masons, and most of what we are calling the global south, much of the built environment consists of work by these people, right? That is something that ends up shaping, in a sense, our cityscape. So in such a scenario, historically, I understand one calls it, whether one calls it vernacular, whether one, whatever one calls it. In this sort of scenario, how it's not so much a question of how relevant is it, but how then do we then look at the practice of architects in that sense? If any of you would like to.
One of the things that I'm sort of also looking at is early 20th century sort of like rise of sort of like architects, right? And to think of that sort of like beginning moment of sort of like transition of what inherited sort of like technologies of sort of like building that they had to sort of like contend with. In the case of sort of like Penang, for example, before say in the 1920s, where you start seeing the rise of, architects with their own sort of like private practice. In the 19th century, Penang, the building sort of like industry was regulated through the clan association, the Carpenters Guild specifically. And this is a particular sort of like type of Masonic organization in Penang, where you need to sort of actually go through an initiation sort of like process. And within the sort of like building sort of like ecology of this Masonic sort of like organization, you have them working with, say, the convict laborers, who will be actually sort of like doing the sort of like hard work of building actually convict laborers from India, right, who were shipped to Penang because it was a penal colony. They would be sort of like doing the hard sort of like work of building up the infrastructure of sort of like Penang. But at the same time, these organizations would sort of like regulate the relationship between sort of like the stonemasons, who are the sort of like cutters of all the sort of like stone from all the sort of smaller islands or from the mainland of sort of like Malaya and shipping it to Penang in order to sort of like build up whatever you sort of see in Penang today. But what they also sort of like had is a sort of like set of knowledge, where if you look at, say, it's called the Carpenters sort of like Guild, and if you look at their sort of like historical sort of like manual, you'd learn that they also have the skill to sort of like curse or sort of like cast a spell on clients who do not honor the sort of like contract, and to make sure that clients on their part don't sort of like fuck up the sort of like building the relationship. And all these sort of like came to pass the moment the sort of like the figure of the architect then sort of took over. But I think the moment the architect sort of like emerges to monopolize this sort of like the industry, the building industry, was also a story about the triumph of capitalism as the greatest sort of form of magic in many ways. And you see them then sort of, in some ways, thinking about capitalism as a sort of like magical kind of vehicle is, I think, quite productive in thinking, the kind of like tension between two competing sort of like sets of building tradition.
Well, I would just say, I think it's also a question of, or perhaps today is not to think of the vernacular and or the traditional in conflict with the architect-made architecture or building, but actually that they can reinforce each other. And so rather than appropriating a vernacular architecture, we might learn from it, especially thinking about climate and thinking about materiality and thinking about construction as one set of methods for understanding that building is essentially also a human activity. We all build, and in effect we build ourselves. And architects, by virtue of their training in whichever realm, whether it was in a university or through working with an engineer or working as a stonemason or a brick mason, is a set of skills for understanding that method for building, obviously. And yet, when we look at the architects, say the master architects, for lack of a better term, what we see is always this conversation happening between what's happening on the ground and then the remove of the view, if you will, the remove of I can now see from above and try to understand scale and context and the movement of people and ideas.
It's okay. Okay. All right. All right. Maybe I'd like to open this up. Are there questions? We have 15 minutes, so I think perhaps we could take some questions. I'm sure. Do I see any hands? There's one here. Okay. I don't think we have a mic.
Thank you. My question to the panel would be, so we were talking about how modernity or architects were influenced by the vernacular. So my question is, and I often think about this, if modernity is a movement, somehow, how does modern architecture impact the vernacular? How, in reverse, and that does happen, doesn't it? Our building methods, techniques, and the way we kind of like design buildings, the local people, that also changes with it. I would like the panel to tell us more about that.
I've always found this problematic because on one hand you'd have, like as you can see from Farhan's slide, that Doc said is trying to be sensitive to the vernacular, and then other architects in Malaysia also trying to adopt this sensitivity towards the vernacular. But on the other hand, you had somebody like Muzharul Islam who rejected the vernacular on day one because he knew that he needed to reject vernacular as not as a source material, but as a style. He needed to reject this in order for modernity to go forward. I remember asking him once about Ramdat architecture, and he said something. He said that once you found out that you can take brick, make it into small shapes, and you can dry it, and you can take mud, make it into small shapes, you can dry it and it becomes brick. And he learned that 2,000 years ago. I have no idea why you want to play around with mud now. So this is very interesting. It's a perspective. It's a perspective of what modernity is and what modernity can do. Not for architecture, but for society itself. And then you have the other gaze, as Farhan is saying, is someone looking at this kind of architecture and trying to be sensitive by adopting things where he thinks that this would be, elements of vernacular would be a nice way to make architecture situated. So this is conflicting, and I've always found this conflicting. Maybe someone over here can put some more light on this.
I think that, of course, there are many different ways to approach this question. First thing is that the way I see the appropriation of vernacular or rejection of vernacular within modernism, if we try to understand is a movement, is that who claims authority on the production of knowledge on building. Like when the consolidation with the Institute of Architects, the licensors, and many other different courts and other things. So we as a profession, the way we evolve the architecture profession, we become the sole authority of the production of knowledge of building industry. And to some extent, one strain of contemporary architecture is that architects, the main profession of, the main goal of our profession is actually not to build, but to produce ideas about building. It's a very avant-garde, but this is also part of the thing. So I think that the main question, the way I understand, is that when architects as a professional group starts to claim the sole authority on the production of building knowledge, we create this segment, so this is vernacular. And we create a self-imposed problem for ourselves, that now we have this category, we are the architects, and we have the others who are the vernaculars, how we are going to incorporate this vernacular knowledge. Are we going to make this distinctly different from the others, or am I going to incorporate them? So the Doxydis' problem was that he was serving the others, but he never asked the others to come and participate in his design process. So he's always the outsider. So he's the authority of the knowledge, but he's looking and observing the others to. And on the case of Muzharul Islam, he understands the climate, and so he is a kind of, I would say that he operates as an extension of the vernacular body of architecture. He does not need to survey the others, but he embodied the otherness within him. So that is one way. Another thing that I just want to comment on rammed art, this I found really interesting, is that I also knew about this. So rammed art architecture, the way it has been actually reinvented in modern architecture, it's very expensive, but it has a very historic context. The first time it was used in modern times, I'm not talking in Mesopotamia, it was a French architect. His name is François Cointreau, during the French Revolution time. So he started a school, architectural school, it's called, and he used the term agriculture, architecture plus agriculture, agritecture. See, you said what? So agritecture was a school, and it was later, this idea of agritecture was moved to Germany, and then also by the David Gilly, it also moved to Russia. Nikolai Lovov also established a school. The whole concept of rammed art architecture after the French Revolution came from a very different perspective. First of all, and here I see this, the historic, dialogue or contradiction and thing, that during that time, Europe was suffering from lumber. I mean that there was no wood, and they did not have enough wood to burn their brick. So that is the context, economic context, and that's why the peasants, the proletariat peasants, during the French Revolution, they could not provide brick. So rammed art became a symbol of proletariat during French Revolution, and that is the beginning. Even Anna, when she is continuing that social utopia, although probably this is not applicable, but they're continuing that same social utopia. So it's a very, very interesting point that introduced.
Okay.
Want to add something is, since I mentioned Muzharul Islam, there's a little difference in how Muzharul Islam sees capital and how Doxydis would see capital. Muzharul Islam, for him, when I say capital, because sometimes when you look at modern architecture, it is capital driven. It's product driven, it's technology driven, it is company driven. There's a lot of role of capital that is inside it. But for Muzharul Islam, he was always able to embody, like he said, he would embody craft. He would embody the craftsman, he would embody the labor in his work. When we see his production, if we just see it, we can look at it as a modern architecture, but it would be less a production of mobilizing capital and more embodying craft and labor and what is from the place. So one has to keep that in mind when you're looking at Muzharul.
Okay. Questions? Okay, 1, 2, any further? All right.
Hi, thank you. Some of us this morning went to the mosque built by Marina Tabassum, and I was just curious to know, the panel's sort of thoughts and position on sort of the position of the women architect in the modernist projects that you've been researching on, and the location of gender in the writing of architecture history that you are invested in.
Well, well, there's a slight problem here on the stage. First problem. Uh, yes, but you know, it's curious, right? That the writing of modernism and the representation of modernism ends up being very almost diametrically opposed to each other. And what you see, I think, in particular, is not a resurrection of women and people of color within architectural discourse and history, but in fact, they've always been there, but just absent, sadly. And so much of what I think young scholars like Farhan and Simon are doing is in effect trying to trace the legacies of these absences to allow for a new positioning of individuals. And I think in the South Asian context in particular, we have on one hand a figure like Minette de Silva, who is instrumental in trying to understand not only her role in Sri Lanka and Ceylon, in the greater world global discourse in particular, but one of the problems is that there is no archive of Minette, and or there's very little. And what has happened is that there's been a new discourse written around her work and around her legacy to such a point where it's just getting kind of cut and pasted into articles and discussions that no longer valorizes the work and her work that she did. That's one problem. Another problem I would say is that the presence of women in particular and people of color in architecture exhibitions. We haven't seen them, unfortunately. And in my institution is a problem, is in and of itself for not presenting this material until recently. So it's, on one hand, it's an erasure, it's an absence, and there is a corrective now, but it's still too, from my perspective, is still too slow and too not enough. Yeah.
I just want to continue on your mark on archives. So it's a major concern for me that it's actually a question not to you, to Nurur Khan, who's actually embedded in one of the probably the first archivist of any sorts of architecture document in Bangladesh, right? So, so what do you think about the future of creating a more, broad and inclusive archives that will give the future generation an opportunity to approach this kind of question like gender and race and all kinds of other things. And of course, the other question is that until today, our discussion about architectural history is so much focused on one building. So what is its relationship with other factors and how we are going to, archive it for our future? So it's an extension, a question on top of question.
Can I add something with that? So also my question is to American and Bangladeshi architects, and thanks to all of you for the wonderful presentation. The thing is that it's really beautiful to see the gallery full of work, inspiration from Muzharul Islam, and people are talking about Bangladeshi architecture. But as all of us know that the current situation of the things Mr. Muzharul Islam made is not in a good situation. Polytechnics and the galleries in Chittagong University and Jahangirnagar University, master plan, everything is in a bad situation. Like, is anybody working for the conservation, or if they have any intention, or it's like just the talk and archive and things like that? Is there have any committee? Or I know many architects are now working and educators, and it's also a question to Farhan. Also. Thank you.
On the first question from Farhan, I think Bangladesh, there we have an inherent problem. We never had a very successful master's program. Undergrad study of architecture is not research-based. It's a very, almost very technical drawing kind of, and doing assignment kind of education. Since we never really had a successful master's program in WET when you were studying or I was studying, it's very recently that they have a master's program. The need for research was almost absent. There was no need for research. So I think the need for research, or when researchers go around asking questions, there comes also a backlash in the sense of, is that where's the archive? So then there comes this notion of that when archives become important, or it is important to have archives. So I think that, I don't know which one's going to happen first, but one of the things that my notion of looking after Muzharul Islam's drawing is, this was all, we're going to lose this if it's not going to be there. So it came from the intention of preserving his work for posterity. So that is one way to look at it. But the real pressure would have been if schools had been more involved of wanting to research his work, then the archives would also grow, and the archive would have to live up to their expectations also. So that's on one point. On the other point, is to answer your question, is that the archives and the alumni, BUET alumni jointly held a talk in BUET, and we asked the Institute of Architects to move on this, because the archives cannot basically engage with a government body to stop any kind of, let's say, vandalization of his work. So this talk of the archive can provide the drawings, the archive can provide evidence of how it was and things like that. But we were trying to get the institute to formulate a body of experts that would look into this matter and would go into a dialogue with the authorities. As you know, in Bangladesh, there is no other way that you'd get anyone to listen from these institutions. I mean, if you look at Dhaka University, they have the Fine Art Institute, they have a library, they have NIPA building, and they're very comfortable to go into those buildings and vandalize it themselves. We're talking Dhaka University right in the middle of Dhaka. So, and the thing is that they don't feel the need to ask anyone whether it's okay to do that. So on one hand, we have people writing books, trying to talk about him or exhibiting his work, but the pressure points have to be executed by someone like the Institute of Architects, or even institutions like BUET itself. An institution can could work as a pressure point for these kind of things.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? There's one here. Simon, would you like to?
First, I want to sort of apologize on behalf of the organizers, precisely because we didn't sort of like consider very clearly that it's an all-male panel, again, and reinforcing that sort of like, sorry, so I apologize for that. But in relation to this sort of like question of gender, I've been thinking a lot about why I'm so sort of like obsessed in sort of really digging up this sort of like history. And very soon I realized that I could never write an architecture history for this, with these two women architects, but I could write a social history of architecture out of this story. And this is a social history about access, about opportunity. And I'm writing principally for my mom, who wanted to become an architect, but could never.
Yeah, it is not a question, but trying to think with what Sneha and Farhan have already asked about construction, the processes of building, making the building, thinking, researching and writing of architectural histories from this part of the world. I work at the Kiran Nadra Museum of Art, and we had the amazing opportunity to organize an exhibition of Mahindraj, the structural engineer who worked with from Corbusier to Charles Correa to Convende to B.V. Doshi, whose slide you showed. So organizing an exhibition like that of a structural engineer really brought out a pocket created a pocket in thinking about architectural histories of South Asia in a very, very distinct way. And in a way, it was so revelatory for us because in one sweep, we were able to think with the extraordinary timeline of, of different moments and also intersecting it with the elements and thinking of the oeuvre of a structural engineer, thinking through the structure itself, thinking through girders, thinking through tensile curves. So it just changed the axis completely, which to our mind wasn't accessible if we had done a survey exhibition of one single architect. So, so that it created a little methodology and orientation to access another angle. So just to, so as one of the examples. So it was quite a revelatory exercise for us and also for our audiences. Yeah, thank you.
I saw that show. It was excellent. Thank you for doing that. And it was, just very briefly, when I've been having conversations with Mahendraji, he talked very much about not necessarily architecture, capital A, but the relationships that developed over time with each of the architects and each of the groups of laborers and the people that he and himself and his team would have to train in order to understand not only the drawings, but how to make the drawings and how to transform a drawing into a new structural form. And it was quite revealing because it was an architecture that was premised upon transformation and premised upon on how structures in and of themselves can redefine the ways that we see and that we occupy space and so forth. So I thought the exhibition was excellent, and it is much needed that we see and we have the opportunity to see, in effect, the other sides or the social histories of what constitutes a modern architecture.
Okay, I think with this we will close this panel, but I wanted to thank all our speakers very much for their presentations. And thank you to the audience for your questions and your engagement. Thank you, everybody.